This video was made in collaboration with Thrustmaster. The A-10's 30mm cannon, it's distinctive, destructive, and has become a fan favorite of many. How could anybody ever say something bad about it? Well, here is a quote for you from just after Desert Storm. The A-10's 30mm cannon is dramatic, but overrated for its utility and effectiveness. That just doesn't sound right now, does it? How could something as popularly celebrated as the A-10's gun, the GAU-8, ever be considered bad or criticized or even called overrated? I mean, the audacity of it. On the internet, we live in an emotionally fueled environment of extremes, and here emotional reactions rather than sober analysis get the clicks. But although I have absolutely no regrets coming in here looking as if I'm wielding a sledgehammer and taking it against the A-10, by the way, I would lose. But while I have no regrets doing that, let's get to the actual analytical part of this video. So as always, welcome to Military Aviation History. I am Chris, and today I want to talk about some of the perceptions, misconceptions, as well as the myths of the A-10 guns. And to do that, I'm going to go through this in a couple of chapters. Starting off with, first I will talk about how the gun, a gun that nobody expected, ended up on the aircraft in the first place. Second, I will talk about its track record, for example in Desert Storm. And then finally, I will talk about its usefulness and why it has this popular reputation that it has nowadays. Also, it is very likely that there are a lot of things about the A-10 that I can't talk about. And when I say very likely, I mean that's a guarantee. I'm making this video, I know what goes into it and what doesn't. But yes, the scope of this video is the scope of this video. So while there are a lot of things to talk about, hint, at the end of this video we're having a little bit of a discussion on that as well. I have a lot of stuff to go through, so let's just get started. By the way, if you're interested in the sources for this video, they are, as with all of my videos on YouTube, in the description below. But should you be a Patreon or a channel member, first of all, thank you very much for the support. Secondly, I've also added direct download links to a bunch of these sources over on Patreon as well as the YouTube community page. So do check that out and enjoy. The war in Vietnam brought to light the pressing need for aircraft that are able to deliver CAS, so close air support. And of course, the Americans had planes like this. They had the A-1 Skyraider or the A-37 Dragonfly. I really like that aircraft, by the way. It's a looker in my opinion. But they operated, even though they didn't specifically look like it, but they operated essentially not much differently to the planes that we see delivering the same sort of support onto the ground as during World War II. They got low, slow, well maybe not that slow, but they got low and close and didn't fire their guns or their rockets or drop their bombs until they saw the whites in the enemy's eyes, figuratively speaking. Of course, technology caught up, and we have planes like the United States Navy's A-6 Intruder, right? That's another cool aircraft, or the A-7 Corsair II. And these aircraft, they were gold-plated, they were so sophisticated, they had new avionics and they had targeting pods, and all of this was suddenly magic. And yes, these planes were a far stretch from sort of the old school cowboy shooting that went on with the earlier models. But that being said, of course, as you got these new technologies and as you got new weapon systems, the range of your engagements would increase as well. And as such, the actual need for guns on these platforms in order to deliver close air support decreased tremendously. This is also a good moment to tell you that I will not be talking about the politics, the Cheyenne, the budgets, the A-7, A-10 or the A-9, A-10 fly-offs and whether they were skewed in favor of the A-10 in the first place, because all of that stuff, while really interesting, is just outside the scope of this video, but maybe not of a future one. Of course, as you know, the Air Force went ahead with the AX program, which eventually led to the A-10 in 1966. But a lot of the early consideration for this platform was still revolving around a 20mm cannon. And I don't mean the fact that the prototype flew with this gun, with a 20mm cannon, because the 30mm wasn't ready yet. No, I mean literally the aircraft was initially conceptualized with 20mm cannons at the most, because that was considered to be just fine for CAS at the time. But that soon changed. The Gun System Study Group published its final report in September 1969, recommending a 30mm internally mounted Gatling gun system together with a family of associated rounds developed especially for close air support. Two guns were the finalists: the GAU-9A, based on the Oerlikon 304RK, and General Electric's GAU-8A, which had previously beaten Philco Ford's GAU-8. In the end, General Electric won hands down. I mean, just look at this chart showing the shoot-off results. It should perhaps be mentioned that the inclusion of a 30mm cannon came as a surprise to many pilots with previous CAS experience, especially those who flew in Vietnam, who considered 20mm to be good enough for soft targets and bombs, rockets and the soon-to-be fielded air-to-ground missiles sufficient for the rest. In fact, the whole project had shifted because of this change. The draft requirements that were drawn up now reflected this. Gone was the initial plan to develop an aircraft that was essentially only a scaled-up A-37 2.0. The new requirements reflected a process by which the AX had gone from being a general-purpose bomb truck to a more specialized cannon-armed tank buster. By the time the A-10 was conducting its first initial test flights, it still had a 20mm cannon, but soon the GAU-8 was ready. It was generally used with a so-called combat mix, which saw a single HEI round, that's a high explosive incendiary round, set between 5 API rounds, using the depleted uranium projectile you of course know. This was meant to provide an answer to enemy tanks, and specifically in the Cold War environment, of course, Soviet tanks. The Combat Damage Assessment Team, CDAT, conducted firings of the A-10 GAU-8 against main battle tanks. CDAT used Soviet T-62s stowed with ammunition, fuel, oil and crew mannequins. The A-10 GAU-8 attacked individual tanks in 5 missions, totaling 7 passes. From 957 rounds fired, it achieved 93 impacts on 6 of 7 tanks, achieving 17 perforations, inflicting 3 catastrophic kills through effects against stowed ammunition and inflicting 2 additional 100% mobility kills. Now it should be noted that during this test, on 2 of these tanks, a single penetrating round from the GAU-8 was enough to knock them out. And in one of these cases, it was a K-kill. A K-kill is essentially the tank goes poof. And on the other case, it was an M-kill, which is a mobility kill. So essentially the tank would no longer be able to move. Now you can take this data in a couple of ways. First of all, yes, the GAU-8 can knock out tanks. T-62s were used, as I said, in this test. It had to do this from the side or rear. It was not going to go through on the front. They tried. There was no option. But in order to do that, let me just check my notes here in order that I get this completely right. If you look at the penetration to rounds fired ratio, we're sitting at a figure of less than 2%. So less than 2% of all the rounds fired actually connected with the target and also penetrated into the tank, causing damage or the destruction, whether that is a real kill or sort of a mobility kill in the first place in these attacks. But it should be remembered that while the gun was able to do that, this is a clinical environment. They were using T-62s, and yes, the T-62 was a tank that they were expected to meet, either if the Cold War got hot directly with the Soviet bloc, or via third-party states in these sort of proxy wars that we see during the Cold War. Alongside a lot of older T-55s, of course, it must also be said. But the test also took place 6 years after the newer T-72 tanks had rolled out of the factory lines. And while they hadn't proliferated just yet, they also did have a new armor layout, which would have made it a lot more harder to knock them out with the GAU-8 in the first place. So that being said, plus the fact that, with the GAU-8, you also have to, you have to get low enough and into a situation where you can use that. But to demonstrate that and show you actually how this gun was used, let's set out a practical example. What I'm going to do is give you a demonstration of a basic A-10 attack using DCS, that's Digital Combat Simulator, and that's going to do really nicely, give you a visual representation and approximation of how it would look like. I'll also be using the Thrustmaster HOTAS Warthog, which is of course modeled after the real A-10's control stick and also taking inspiration from the real thing when it comes to the throttle quadrant. Now for me this is a big upgrade since I've been using this since about 2014. This is Thrustmaster's 1600M. And yeah, this is the stick that I've been using in the past. If you've ever seen flight simulation footage on my channel, well, this is the stick I used. It's an old faithful, it has never let me down, and it will remain my backup stick. But as I was preparing for this video, Thrustmaster was kind enough to offer their top-of-the-line model in preparation for this video. Now the A-10 in DCS is one of the most complex modules, and jumping into it is quite a challenge. But that's how I like it, and thanks to Jacques' guide, Ralphie Dude's tutorial series, the in-game tutorial, and the fact that using an original replica control stick makes for a much easier transition as well, I've been logging quite a few hours in the A-10, represented here in this totally not staged stock footage. I'm still new to it, so for all you A-10 fans on DCS, feel free to offer advice to me or new or prospective DCS pilots in the comment section, and I'll hopefully be streaming some of my DCS adventures soon as well. But for now, let's get cracking. For this, I'm going to attack a small number of stationary vehicles. I'm sure they have a name, but we'll just call them targets. As I go into my dive, let's go through the heads-up display. As you can see, I have my gun selected and I am using Combat Mix, CM, giving me 5 API to each HEI round. The reticle I use here is the CCIP reticle. That's continuously computed impact point. Displayed here are an outer and an inner circle, 2 pippers and a number. The inner circle moves counterclockwise and gives a visual cue on the range to the target. A full circle indicates more than 12,000 feet, whereas the 9, 6 and 3 o'clock position indicate a respective reduction of 3,000 feet. The number indicates the range in nautical miles. Depending on targets, I want to fire somewhere between 1.5 to 0.6 for the soft targets that we have here. But for tanks, I certainly shouldn't be firing above 1.0. I wouldn't get any results until coming closer. Finally, the 2 pippers indicate the CCIP for the API and HEI rounds. You notice that the HEI pipper will move upwards as we close in on the target. As I line up my aircraft, I move the pippers over the targets. And then I start to depress the trigger to the first stage. This activates PAC, which automatically stabilizes my aircraft and provides a good firing platform. Once I am happy, I hit the target with a few short bursts. And it looks like we've scored some hits, so let's have another go. Now, even though this is a simulator, it shows you some of the real issues when flying an A-10. Using the guns, you will need to operate at lower altitudes in an area that can easily be covered with AA guns or something like a man-portable IR air-to-ground missile, limiting the usefulness of the gun in an environment where those lower altitudes are not permissible. Yes, the A-10 can take a hit, but that's not to say that it should, especially if it can drop bombs or fire Mavericks from higher altitudes where it is safer. Of course, radar SAMs are an issue as well, but keep all of the things that I just showed you in mind as we go through the analysis for Desert Storm. And if DCS or flight simulations in general are your jam, or if you're going to get into them and if you're looking to set yourself up for it, do check out Digital Combat Simulator and especially also Thrustmaster. In the description below, I have added a link to their assortment of control peripherals, amongst which you will find sticks that will be setting you up nicely as a beginner or also as a dedicated flight simmer with something like the Thrustmaster HOTAS Warthog. Fast forward then a couple of years and we are in the midst of the preparations of what, well, would eventually become Desert Storm, right? And knowing the presence of Soviet-style armor in the arsenal of Iraq, and in fact Iraq had a lot of these tanks, the A-10 was of course considered an asset that had to be deployed in the theater. To ensure the greatest amount of anti-armor capability in the theater, the Commander-in-Chief of the Central Command specifically requested the accelerated deployment of US Air Force A-10 units. Now, there are many figures from Desert Storm that support the claim that the A-10 was a capable tank-killing platform and that it provided some good close air support as well. But looking at these figures more closely, and especially how they were created, well, that gives us some reason to pause and think. Check this out. Analysts initially routinely rejected any claim for destroyed armored vehicles made by a pilot of an aircraft other than the A-10, the only aircraft they were inclined to credit with armor kills, since this was its intended purpose. That last quote comes from this book here. This would be Air Power Applied, edited by John Andreas Olsen, and I received this as a complimentary copy from the United States Naval Institute Press from time ago. But when I posted this quote on my social media, hint, follow me on Twitter, The Book of Faces, and Instant Gratification, you can find the links in the description below. But when I posted that, it was one of my best performing social media postings ever, which shows us two things. First of all, I don't know how to use social media, if that's the best thing I have on offer. By the way, the book is great. That's not a slight against this book. You really should be getting it. But what I really want to say is that really seemed to hit a nerve with people. You know, that really was something that was interesting to a lot of you and also to me. So I started to dig deeper into how these kill claims and sort of the ideas that we have about Desert Storm and the efficiency, as well as the effectiveness of the A-10 that is commonly applied to that conflict really pans out if we look at the methodology of where these figures and these claims come from. And yeah, the more I started to dig into this, the more I saw that there are a couple of issues. So check this out. For some aircraft, such as the F-117, there is relatively good data about the number of sorties conducted, while for others, such as the A-10, numerous questions remain about the most basic kind of performance data. Data on a large number of A-10 strike events were unclear or contradictory. Bomb damage assessment, or BDA, that being the study of damage inflicted on enemy units and installations, was indeed difficult during Desert Storm, especially with the A-10. The effectiveness of air power in Desert Storm was inhibited by the aircraft's sensors in identifying and acquiring targets and the inability to collect and disseminate timely battle damage assessments, BDA. At least 1/3 of the A-10 strike data could not be accurately determined from the original records, and researchers were not able to reconcile the inconsistencies. Added to this, there was also initially an issue with the methodology and the ignoring of certain types of reports. Analysts drew on A-10 pilot reports while they ignored those from F-16, B-52s and all other aircraft. When General Horner questioned an analyst about this practice, he received an answer that damaged the credibility of the Army's BDA briefings. I said, "Why do you use the A-10 pilot reports?" And he said, "Well, it's got 2 people in the airplane. You got 2 sets of eyes." I didn't say anything. I just let that fall on the floor like a mighty drop of putty. Eventually changes to the analysis were made, but this was still very selective. Adding to the confusions were problems with the methodology and effectiveness of estimates. Analysts used pilot reports or onboard imagery from only 4 aircraft: A-10s, F-111s, F-15s, and AV-8s. Other aircraft types conducting attack sorties against Iraqi ground forces were not even counted. Analysts reduced credited kills to 1/2 of F-111 and 1/3 for the A-10. While the official number should always be taken with a pinch of salt and be considered more as a guideline than a hard number, what is really interesting is how the A-10 or the US forces and the coalition forces as a whole achieve these numbers, because, well, little of this has to do with the gun or close air support in the first place. The A-10 was used in a role for which it had never been intended: battlefield air interdiction missions against targets in the enemy's rear areas. Now this doesn't surprise, of course, since close air support was really only needed with the ground offensive, and that only launched on the trailing edge of the air campaign, as we can see in this graph. By and large, the A-10 did well in the battlefield air interdiction role, but it's not that this was something special. And although APCs and artillery positions could be successfully attacked with the gun, it was not the weapon of choice against tanks, and oftentimes the A-10s were actually restricted to altitudes where they could not effectively use the gun in the first place. While the A-10s demonstrated their durability attacking ground targets, the F-111 Aardvarks, the F-15 Strike Eagles, and the Navy's A-6 Intruders made a specialty of what came to be known as tank plinking. These operations, another goal for FIRST, began when aircrews realized that aircraft with thermal imaging or infrared IR seekers could locate and destroy individual pieces of armor. During the course of the war, F-111s were credited with destroying approximately 1,000 tanks with GBU-12s, and A-10s using Maverick missiles were credited with about the same number. The focus here is on precision weapons, so GBUs or AGMs, because they show, when it comes, for example, to tank plinking or tank hunting or tank busting, whatever you want to call it, how much the air weapon has changed since the sort of World War II style drop and pray. So why don't we look at the breakdown of all the ammunitions, or the majority or the main ammunitions rather, used by the A-10s during Desert Storm, starting here with the gun and then going over to the Maverick missile. During Desert Storm, 940,000 rounds of combat mix were fired, an average of 119 per sortie, which is essentially just a 2-second burst. So given the prominence of the gun, that's probably less than we'd expect, but it makes sense given the restrictions to the A-10's operational altitudes. But looking at those, what about missiles and bombs? The A-10 fired 4,801 Maverick missiles, which was more than 90% of the Mavericks fired by Air Force aircraft. Let's still have a look at the kill claims, and we will find the following breakdown. Keeping in mind what I said earlier about kill confirmations, the methodology, what kill to count and what kill not to count, and also that target identification, so discriminating a tank or self-propelled artillery piece from a truck, provided a constant challenge. Of these kills, it is likely that a portion of them also went to bombs, although eventually A-10's actually standard loadout changed. A typical ordnance load for A-10s was 2 AGM-65 Mavericks or 4 bombs. Later in the war, the Maverick load was increased to 4. This then is a reflection of the overall success coalition forces had with precision weapons. But there are also practical reasons of why these weapons were preferred. I mean, just remember the practical example I showed you earlier with DCS. If you want to use the gun, you have to get low and you have to get close. And if you go into those sort of altitude bandwidths, then you're going to be running into the risk of being shot at by SPAAs or AAAs or IR manpads. And yes, you can say the A-10 can take it. It can take a couple of rounds from AAA. It can take an IR manpad to the face and continue to fly. But should it? I mean, you've seen the pictures of A-10s coming back with damage. And yes, it is impressive. And yes, it is a testimony to the resilience and the redundancies that have been built into these aircraft. But should it really do that? You're going to have an aircraft that comes back that has to be fixed up. It's not going to be able to fly a couple of missions, well, it depends on how big the damage is. You know, maybe it can get fixed up in a couple of hours, maybe a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks. But that's one airframe that you then no longer can use. And for what? Because you had to show that you can take it? No, that's not how it works. You stay outside of the danger zones as far as you can take it. Of course it's a dangerous job. Of course you're going to have stuff flung at you whether you fly at these altitudes or not, but you're going to decrease the amount of risk that you're exposed to if you have something like an AGM that can take out these targets from a distance and an altitude where you're more secure. You can take it is not an argument that you should follow if there is a risk of getting damaged or shot down. Although the cannon did not completely fulfill its traditional tank busting role, it proved useful in the war. That being said, also consider that while the gun was considered effective, the number of gun kills was unclear due to conservative rules for performing bomb damage assessment during and after the war. Now the Maverick gave another advantage, and that is that the A-10 got some night attack capabilities with it. Rudimentary, really rudimentary. I mean, the A-10 wasn't supposed to be used at night, but since one of the Mavericks, the newer Mavericks, had IR seeker heads, they could be used at night. Initially, the Mavericks were based on an electro-optical seeker, usually abbreviated EO. And an electro-optical seeker is a very powerful device. On your heads down display, you can really zoom in and try to find the target located and then fire out your Maverick. But it still functions essentially, when you break it down, like nothing more than an extension of your good old Mark I eyeball. You're reliant on good lighting conditions, and you're reliant on line of sight, and you're reliant on being able to personally identify the target in whatever environment that you're seeing. with an IR seeker head, a lot of the work is taken away from you, and it also allows you to employ the weapon if you do not have direct line of sight. Maybe the target is behind foliage or shrubbery or trees. You can still pick that out. Or you only see it partially behind a building maybe. The IR seeker head will find that bad boy and you will be able to fire off your missile once you have a good angle to it. And that really is a game changer, not just for the Mavericks, not just for the A-10s, but for aviation as a whole, really. And it wouldn't have just been well, it wasn't just a game changer in Desert Storm, but it also would have been extremely useful, for example, in Central Europe if something would have happened. Because in that environment where there's a lot of wooded areas, a lot of covered areas, an IR seeker head Maverick is a lot more useful than an electro-optical one. Of course, the question is also whether the A-10 is really necessary for all of this. I mean, yes, of course, it fired 90% of the Mavericks during Desert Storm. It was the primary Maverick delivery system, but other aircraft like the F-111 achieved very credible success against tanks as well, using, for example, GBUs. And they were very effective in that role as well. And a Maverick could potentially also have been fired by another plane as well. That being said, plus the fact that the A-10 was also able to operate in the way that it operated, because while the Iraqis generally allowed the coalition operational freedom to a point that you really would have thought that they would have been more aggressive with their anti-aircraft defenses, but they weren't. And that is something that of course helped a lot of the platforms that the coalition forces fielded. But yeah, they also allowed the A-10 to operate in such a way. And in fact, look at the following graph detailing A-10 and F-16 losses, and then we're going to have a discussion on that as well. Of 21 aircraft hit below 12,000 feet, 12 were A-10 casualties. A-10s were permitted to operate below 12,000 feet to as low as 4,000 on January 31st and thereafter. After January 31st, it is when 10 of the 12 medium to low altitude casualties occurred. After weeks of holding their fire, the Iraqis launched 8 IR SAMs, bagging 2 and damaging 1 A-10. These losses produced an immediate change in the A-10's mission profile. Pulled back from the heavily defended Kuwaiti theater of operations, where the Republican Guard was deployed. With few exceptions, the A-10s also stopped daytime strafing. Moving the A-10 south proved a viable strategy. As General Horner noted, we had F-16s go after the Republican Guard. While Desert Storm is a case study in itself, and while Iraqi air defense systems should perhaps have been more aggressive in their employment, note how this graph reflects the danger of operating at lower altitudes. And when you look at the casualties, especially here inflicted by IR and AAA sites, and this would have been even more striking if I had included some of the missions flown by other coalition forces, especially also the British. Now, sure enough, you can argue, even with the graphs that I've shown here, and even when you look at the extended graphs into the sources themselves, you can still argue that, well, the A-10 can take it. 1 ton of titanium redundancies wherever your eye meets the aircraft. Isn't that great? Well, yeah, but if you look at the documentation, you can also see that F-111s, F-117s and F-16s achieved similar success, very credible success as well against tanks, and still operate apparently in a much safer environment. The loss ratios were a lot lower. And that might not be a massive factor in Iraq, where of course coalition forces achieved a total and swift victory, but how any conflict involving NATO forces and any sort of peer adversary where you're going to meet an enemy that has capabilities and also the ability to use these capabilities in a much more aggressive and integrated way, then the differences between these platforms are really going to start to matter. And a lot of this reminds me of what was something that one USAF pilot told me, who had a lot of CAS experience, when I talked to him in preparation for this video. What do you want? A plane that doesn't get shot, or a plane that can take a hit but then stands around the airfield being useless while getting fixed up? Of course, the gun is famous and beloved by many. Why shouldn't it be? But considering this, how much of this has probably to do with sort of the YouTube-filled internet environment that we operate in now, where videos of A-10s delivering close air support, for example, in Afghanistan, have been watched in the thousands, if not into the millions.
Come on, man. They're about to do a gun run. You need to get down. Let's go, buddy. A-10 saving the day again, baby.
It is indisputable that the A-10 has provided some excellent support to the boots on the ground, for example, in Afghanistan. That is absolutely indisputable. I mean, putting a lot of HEI rounds on a target, they're no longer using API rounds with combat mechs. They relied uniquely on HEI rounds in Afghanistan because, well, you didn't have targets like tanks. You only had soft targets that you really need to contend. Yeah, HEI round from a 30mm is all you need in that environment. And the distinctiveness of the A-10 and the specialist role that it has, and the fact that the way we see it being used on the internet really taps into our image of what close air support is supposed to look like, and is very similar also to many cultural products that we have, like movies or video games, pictures, paintings, whatever floats your boat, right? I think that does contribute to the sort of popularity of the plane that, given its use in Afghanistan, makes sense, but then becomes overhyped and sort of applied to the mission set that maybe the A-10 was supposed to be employed in the start, but that probably wouldn't have worked out in the way that we nowadays think it would have. At the same time, of course, in defense of the A-10 here as well, it is indisputable that with precision ammunitions, the A-10 can operate in a safe environment and still fulfill its mission. In fact, it would fulfill its missions better with precision ammunition than with its gun, specifically now thinking about tanks. Doing so from safer altitudes and not having to rely uniquely on the inbuilt gun that really would put it into harm's way first, because you don't want, especially if you're contending with a near-peer adversary, you don't want to have useless aircraft stuck on the runway just waiting to be fixed up. You want to rotate aircraft constantly and have as many sorties and flyouts as possible and really harass the enemy wherever you can find him. You don't want to have a plane on the tarmac being fixed up just because it can take it, right? Gun passes really only work when the enemy has nothing to put up against you. And if you look at the environment like in Afghanistan, yeah, of course, the A-10 reigns supreme because, of course it will. You know, the destructiveness of a 30mm HEI round is incredible in that environment. If you're trying to take out a military target, a fortification, a gun or mortar position, or some sort of structure where you have insurgents hiding out and putting your own troops under pressure, then a 30mm round, or not just a single 30mm round, a lot of 30mm rounds, will make short work of that structure. And of course, the support in that environment that the A-10 gives is absolutely excellent. But you can also pair that with other weapon systems like UCAVs or light attack aircraft, LAAs, and have a complementary rotation of overwatch on your own troops. You don't specifically need the A-10, although of course it's a good asset to have, and in certain environments that's the best asset you have. But when it comes to tanks, over the last 80 years, of course, there has been a lot of discussion and a lot of controversy about this move away from specialist platforms over to multi-role aircraft. We've seen this in the United States Air Force. We've seen this in the United States Navy. We've seen this with a lot of air forces around the globe. There has always been sort of this bias towards the specialist because we assume that that platform will just do it better. But looking at modern multi-role aircraft, looking at the technologies involved, looking at the capabilities that this gives the aircraft, we can really see from the data that in many cases the multi-role aircraft is able to fulfill mission sets that initially we considered the role of a specialist. Because at the end of the day, if a tank was destroyed by a Maverick, does it matter if the A-10 fired it, or another aircraft fired it, or that this tank was destroyed with a Maverick or GBU or anything else you can drop on it? No, it doesn't. What matters is that the tank is gone and the aircraft that did it is safe and can fly back, be restocked, refueled, and go out again. And that's really what you want. When I started working on this video, I had a clear vision. And then as I started to research more and more, my notes grew and grew and grew. And yeah, I ended up with a video now where I didn't even touch upon the majority of the things that I actually wanted to address, because I realized a lot of these things have to be broken down into chunks. So having a gazillion things to talk about when it comes to the A-10, I collected some of those things, of course, in this video. But here are some other things that I might want to do in the future. So for example, how I will get on that in the future, but now it is really up to you. Tell me what you think about the A-10. Tell me what you think about this topic. Tell me what you think about the GAU-8. Has your opinion changed? Do you want to contribute something? Actually, just go nuts in the comment section. Just give me your feedback, give me your ideas, add to the discussion. I really look forward to seeing what all of you have to say here. And I, of course, want to say a big thank you here for Frostmaster for the collaboration we had on this video. I really enjoyed working with them on this, so do check out the link in the description below also for their control peripheral arsenal that you can have a choice from. They really provide some fantastic control peripherals there. And of course, I also want to thank my patrons and my channel members who are the heart and soul of this channel, and a lot of them are also on Discord, on our personal Discord channel. So if you want to join the discussion there, do check out those two options for supporting the channel as well. And finally, I also want to say a big thank you here to the people who proofread the script, as well as the people that I talked to in preparation of making this video and some of the other videos that I most likely will do. You know who you are. Thank you. And as always, I wish all of you a great day and see you in the sky.